Mary Bell was born on May 26, 1957, in Newcastle, England. From the beginning, her childhood was marked by instability and neglect. Her mother, Elizabeth, known as Betty, was often away and reportedly left Mary in the care of other people. The transcript describes a home where Mary received little protection, affection, or stability, and where frightening experiences became part of her earliest years. Accounts in the source describe serious abuse and neglect, including incidents in which Mary was allegedly placed in dangerous situations while she was still very young. Instead of learning that the world was a safe place, Mary was growing up surrounded by fear, rejection, and adults who repeatedly failed to protect her. As Mary grew older, the effects of that environment became increasingly visible. Her behavior at home and at school was unpredictable, with severe mood swings and disturbing incidents involving other children. She struggled socially and became increasingly isolated, with only one close friend, Norma Bell, a girl who lived nearby. The transcript presents Mary not simply as a child who behaved badly, but as a deeply troubled child whose environment had already shaped the way she understood violence, trust, and relationships. Yet none of this could explain what was about to happen. By the time Mary was 11, the warning signs were no longer easy to ignore. In 1968, an incident involving a young boy brought Mary's behavior into public view. According to the transcript, a 3-year-old boy was found badly injured after falling from a height, and witnesses reported that Mary and Norma had been playing with him shortly before the incident. The investigation also included allegations that the girls had attempted to hurt the child by the neck. Police questioned both girls, but because of their young ages, the response was limited largely to warnings. It was an early opportunity to recognize that something was seriously wrong, but no major intervention followed. Only weeks later, another child, 4-year-old Martin Brown, was found dead inside an abandoned building near Margaret Road. Children in the neighborhood commonly played around these unfinished and abandoned houses, and at first there was uncertainty about what had happened. Medical examination did not establish that Martin had died from poisoning, despite a bottle being found nearby. The circumstances remained troubling, especially after Mary and Norma appeared at the scene and later spoke to Martin's family. The transcript says Mary eventually admitted responsibility for Martin's death, turning what had previously looked like disturbing childhood behavior into something far more serious. The day after Martin's death, Mary and Norma were involved in another disturbing incident at a local nursery. According to the transcript, the two girls broke into the building and caused extensive damage. Books were torn apart, equipment was damaged, and objects were thrown around the room. But among the destruction, police reportedly discovered handwritten notes referring to murder and Martin Brown. Those notes changed the atmosphere surrounding the investigation. What might once have been dismissed as childish misbehavior now appeared to investigators as something that demanded much closer attention. Even then, the authorities reportedly treated the incident as little more than a children's prank. 2 days later, while Martin's body was being prepared for burial, Mary and Norma went to his home and asked to see him. When Martin's mother explained that they could not see him, Mary reportedly responded that she already knew he was dead and wanted to see him in his coffin. For a grieving mother, the moment was deeply disturbing. For investigators looking back later, it became another piece of a much larger pattern. And then, before the community could even recover from Martin's death, another child disappeared. On July 31, 1968, 3-year-old Brian Howe was playing outside near his home with his brother and sister. As evening approached and Brian failed to return, his family became increasingly worried. A search began that same night, and before long, Brian's body was discovered near a playground, concealed between concrete blocks and partially covered with grass. Investigators immediately noticed that the circumstances were different from an ordinary childhood accident. There were signs suggesting that Brian had been deliberately attacked, and investigators began considering the possibility that his killer was another child. The investigation expanded rapidly. More than 100 investigators became involved, and police questioned approximately 1,200 children in the surrounding area. Mary and Norma were among those questioned because witnesses had reportedly seen them with Brian that afternoon. At first, both girls denied knowing him, but their accounts began to conflict. Eventually, they acknowledged that they had been with Brian. Mary attempted to make her story sound convincing by describing details about what happened afterward, including an object connected with the crime. That detail became a critical mistake. Detective James Dixon reportedly recognized that Mary's account contained information she should not have known unless she had been directly involved. Investigators began focusing their attention on her and Norma, When Norma's parents contacted police, they reportedly said Norma already knew something about Brian's death. Investigators returned to question her, and according to the transcript, Norma eventually described being taken to a location where Brian was already dead. She also said Mary demonstrated how Brian had been killed and described other details surrounding the attack. When investigators confronted Mary with Norma's account, Mary initially denied it and accused Norma of trying to manipulate the investigation, but Mary was only 11 years old and had no clear way out. Eventually, according to the transcript, she admitted that she had killed Brian. Physical evidence also became important. Fibers recovered from Brian's clothing were reportedly consistent with clothing belonging to Mary and Norma. The investigation had finally connected the earlier incidents, the statements, and the physical evidence. The question was no longer whether Mary had been involved. The question became what could possibly have turned a child into a killer. On August 7, 1968, Brian Howe's funeral drew a large crowd. According to the transcript, Mary was later seen near the cemetery before her arrest. The story describes her standing near the cemetery gates and reacting in a disturbing way while Brian's coffin was visible. It was an image that shocked the officers who witnessed it, because it seemed completely disconnected from the grief surrounding the child's death. Mary and Norma were subsequently charged in connection with Brian's death, while the investigation continued to separate the roles of the two girls. The distinction between Mary and Norma eventually became crucial. The transcript states that Norma admitted she had not killed either child and had not physically harmed them. Instead, she described herself as following Mary's actions and being influenced by her. Mary, meanwhile, was portrayed as the primary aggressor. Her history of abuse, neglect, emotional instability, and increasingly violent behavior became central to understanding how she had reached this point. But understanding a person's history does not erase the suffering of the victims, and the case forced investigators and the public to confront an uncomfortable question: how responsible can a child be for something so terrible? Mary's childhood had been filled with experiences no child should have been forced to endure. The transcript describes neglect from her mother, repeated exposure to unsafe adults, and severe abuse. At school, her behavior had already raised concerns. Long before the deaths of Martin and Brian, she had attacked other children and displayed disturbing patterns that suggested she was struggling with emotions and impulses she could not control. Yet those warning signs did not lead to the kind of protection or intervention that might have changed her path. That does not mean her childhood made the killings inevitable. Childhood trauma can help explain behavior, but it cannot turn violence into destiny. What makes the case so unsettling is the combination of severe neglect, repeated warning signs, and missed opportunities to intervene. Mary was still a child herself when the adults around her failed to recognize how dangerous her behavior had become. By the time authorities finally understood the seriousness of the situation, 2 young boys were dead, and several other children had reportedly already experienced frightening encounters with her. The legal proceedings eventually separated Mary from Norma in terms of responsibility. The transcript states that Mary was convicted and sentenced for the deaths, while Norma was cleared after it became clear that she had not directly participated in the killings. Norma reportedly reacted with relief during the proceedings, while Mary remained visibly emotional behind her. The courtroom was no longer simply dealing with 2 children who had behaved badly. It was confronting the consequences of violence, the vulnerability of children, and the failures that had occurred long before the case reached court. Mary's case became one of the most disturbing examples of juvenile crime in Britain because of her age. She was 11 when the crimes occurred. That fact made the story difficult to comprehend, but it also made her childhood impossible to ignore. Behind the shocking headlines was a child who had herself been exposed to profound harm. At the same time, the families of Martin Brown and Brian Howe were left with something that could never be repaired: the loss of 2 children who should have been growing up, playing outside, and coming home to their families. Looking back, the case raises questions that do not have simple answers. Could earlier intervention have prevented the violence? Could Mary have been removed from the environment in which she was being abused? Could the authorities have acted more decisively after the earlier incidents involving children? The transcript strongly emphasizes these missed opportunities, suggesting that the warning signs were present long before Brian's death. But history cannot tell us with certainty what would have happened if someone had intervened sooner. What we can say is that Mary Bell's story was not created in a single moment. It developed through years of instability, neglect, abuse, isolation, and increasingly dangerous behavior. None of those circumstances excuse what happened to Martin and Brian, Their deaths remain the center of the tragedy, but they also show why cases involving troubled children require more than punishment alone. Sometimes the most important question is not simply, what did this child do? But also, what happened to this child before anyone finally noticed? Mary Bell's case remains disturbing decades later, because it forces people to hold two difficult truths at the same time. Two children lost their lives, and their families endured unimaginable grief. At the same time, the person responsible was herself only a child who had experienced serious neglect and abuse. The story is therefore not simply about a young killer. It is also about a childhood that went terribly wrong, adults who failed to protect a vulnerable child, warning signs that were missed, and a community that only fully understood the danger after lives had already been lost. In the end, the case leaves behind more questions than comfortable answers. Martin Brown and Brian Howe should be remembered first as children whose lives were taken far too soon. Mary Bell's story, meanwhile, remains a grim reminder that childhood trauma can have devastating consequences when it goes unseen and untreated, but it should never be treated as an excuse for violence. The tragedy lies in every layer of the story. 2 young lives ended, another childhood destroyed, and a series of missed chances that can never be recovered.